Okay, welcome to Writer P training. P as in Paul. This is lead-based paint disclosure. This one is used quite a bit. Um, Now, if you are at Future Home Realty and are using the seller's disclosure that we suggest or require, which is the FARBAR seller's disclosure, the lead-based paint is built into that. But if other people are not using that or you need to amend or add this, obviously we'll talk about it. So let's read the top intro paragraph that I've created. Listen to the audio, of course. Once again, this should be a pattern. Since this is a disclosure, it should be completed by the seller prior to the buyer initialing or signing. This obviously makes complete sense on any disclosure, as how can we ask a buyer to initial or sign something if the seller has not completed a disclosure? Note that the seller would need to disclose if they have knowledge. It doesn't ask them to be an expert. They don't have to know if any lead-based paint. They don't have to be an expert, but if they do know of any lead-based paint issues, they need to obviously disclose that. Also note that this writer is not required if the home was built after 1978. It's actually after 1977, pre-1978. If it's built in 1978, I generally tended to use it myself, but technically it's 78 or later. Does not require that. So once again, let's take a look. I put the buyer's initials in red, and that was because we should not be having this filled out or initialed by the buyer at the initial part of offer if the seller has not completed it. Now, again, if you're taking a listing, then, and you know it was built in 1942, excuse me, I'll get a sip of water. You know, it was built in 1942 and you have the listing, then you need to have the seller fill this out, and there's no reason not to have that as an attachment in the listing so people can have it at their disposal already completed by the seller, so it's not to hold up the offer process. But anyway, just make sure that it is completed. There's some spots where the sellers need to initial, buyers need to initial, and the listing agent and selling agent need to sign as well. You'll see here in a minute. This is just general information about the findings that lead-based paint could have potential health risks, and they stopped manufacturing that paint in 1978, so that's why we don't have to do it if it's built after. First part, the seller's chance to disclose. The seller is saying that either A, the presence of lead-based paint, they either have, there is known lead-based paint, okay, and it is present, so the seller would check that box in an initial. If the seller has no knowledge, again, that doesn't mean that there isn't, it means that they have no knowledge, then they can check this box and initial there. Both sellers, if there are two, need to initial that. The records and reports, the seller has provided the buyer with all available records. You can check that if there are records. More often than not, seller has no reports or records. They would check that and initial there. All right, so there's the disclosure. Then the buyer comes along and says, okay, I've received copies of anything that's listed above, right? Available reports if they had checked that box. They initial here. Buyer has received a pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. That's available anywhere. It's through the U.S. Housing and Urban Development. They need to, they're acknowledging that they've read it. We have a copy, I believe, in our miscellaneous forms. You should always have a copy. You can get them for free. You can direct the buyer where to download it themselves. But they are going to have to initial acknowledging that they have received that pamphlet. And then the buyer has either received a 10-day opportunity to conduct a risk assessment or waived the opportunity to conduct. Now, again, you should be having this discussion with the buyers even before you make any offers so that, excuse me again, if they, so that when they're ready to go, I always presented the buyers with a copy of a contract, and then some of the more common writers, like if I would probably present them with this and say, hey, look, just so you're aware, you're going to have to sign this if we find a home that's built prior to 1978, so you might make yourself aware of it, all right? And then down here, licensee has informed the seller of the seller's obligations. This is generally for the listing agent, all right? Sometimes both licensees do it, but whoever would be representing the seller would need to do that. And then all parties are going to have to initial, or sign, including seller listing licensee, buyer selling licensee. Again, in red here, because we should not be signing this if it has not been completed by the seller in advance. And you don't want to do this because you could get in a lot of trouble, all right, if you're intentionally avoiding or withholding information on this. All right, pretty self-explanatory. Make sure you follow the pattern, though, and again, because it's a disclosure, never have the buyer initial or sign until it has been completed by the seller. Thanks.